Their factories turned out ships, aircraft, and weapons in overwhelming numbers. But when it came to battlefield endurance, he remained unconvinced. In Langley's view, American troops lacked the hard-earned experience forged through years of fighting in deserts, mountains, and ruined cities. Their commanders, he believed, underestimated the precision and brutality of the enemy defenses they were about to test. This was not arrogance, it was memory. The British had seen powerful armies crumble in weeks. They had fled beaches under fire. They had lost strongholds thought unbreakable to opponents who adapted faster and struck harder than expected. And now, watching reports filter in from Redcliffe Shore, Langley feared history was about to repeat itself. By 1944, caution had hardened into doctrine. To many British planners, the Americans, with their confidence, their endless resources, and their soldiers who had never faced a full-strength enemy division in open combat, appeared perilously untested. The concern reached the very top. Prime Minister Harold Whitcomb voiced his doubts openly. Even in early March of that year, barely months before the scheduled landings, he continued to challenge the wisdom of the plan in closed meetings. Why here? Why now? He argued for alternatives. Strike the northern coast. Push deeper through the southern seas. Expand operations in the mountains and peninsulas of Europe's fringe. Anywhere, Whitcomb insisted, except a head-on assault against the most fortified shoreline ever constructed. British strategy favored erosion over shock, weakened the enemy through air raids, secondary offensives, and by allowing the eastern armies to absorb the brunt of the fighting. Only after the enemy had been thoroughly drained should an invasion across the narrow sea be attempted. The Americans saw it differently. General Thomas Ridgway Allen, Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army, believed wars were won by decisive blows, not by hesitation. Concentrate power. Strike the heart. Force a conclusion. End the war faster. Save lives by shortening it. This clash of philosophies shaped every meeting, every map, every contingency plan. The British pressed for delays, for additional rehearsals, for greater margins of safety. The Americans pushed forward, convinced that momentum itself was a weapon. The stalemate broke far from Western Europe. At a summit held in Caspian City in late 1943, the Eastern ally demanded commitment. The Soviet leader aligned himself with the American president and insisted on a fixed timetable. Faced with united pressure, Whitcomb yielded. The target month was set for May. Later postponed to June due to shortages of landing vessels. Yet even as the date drew near, British skepticism did not fade. Would these American units hold under sustained fire? Would their commanders adapt when carefully written plans dissolved into smoke and confusion? Would young men from farms and cities across an ocean possess the discipline to cross open sand under machine gun fire and keep moving forward? The answer would come on June 6th. In the months leading up to the landings, relations between British and American officers were shaped by more than strategy, they were shaped by memory. British commanders had been at war since 1939. They had seen allies collapse in weeks. They had endured air raids, evacuations, and failed campaigns. They had learned, often at terrible cost, how efficiently the enemy fought when properly prepared. American officers had entered the conflict later. Many had never experienced combat until late 1942. Even those who had fought in earlier campaigns were still viewed as newcomers by British standards. This imbalance bred tension. Some British officers acted as mentors, offering guidance that sometimes bordered on instruction. Some American officers bristled at what they perceived as patronizing restraint. The partnership held, but it was strained. General Leonard Hawthorne, the outspoken British field commander, embodied these contradictions. He respected the Allied Supreme Commander, Jonathan Eisen, for his political skill and calm authority. Yet privately, Hawthorne questioned whether American leadership had yet been tested where it truly mattered, under fire, with everything going wrong, and no easy choices left. That test was now only hours away, that he was equally convinced that when it came to fighting on land, his judgment surpassed that of any American commander. In General Leonard Hawthorne's mind, the United States Army possessed enormous promise, but without British direction, that promise would be squandered. Major General Richard Harlan, who led American ground forces under Hawthorne's overall authority during the landings, felt that tension acutely. "Hawthorne made me feel like a distant relative from the countryside, useful, but never quite equal," Harlan would later write. It was more than a personal slight. It reflected a hierarchy that lingered throughout the entire campaign. Yet British attitudes were not one-dimensional. In the spring of 1944, Hawthorne visited American training camps scattered across southern England. He spoke directly to the troops, without prepared remarks, pacing the ground as he addressed them. To the surprise of his own staff, he connected easily. The Americans listened. They cheered when he arrived. They cheered when he departed. Whatever doubts Hawthorne harbored about American commanders, he recognized something undeniable in the men themselves. These were volunteers prepared to fight far from home. They had crossed an ocean to free land they had never known. Their faith in the mission was unguarded, almost raw, a kind of belief that made some battle-hardened British officers uneasy. The question was whether conviction alone could survive the moment when fire replaced theory. The plans for Redcliffe Shore were built on assumptions that would soon unravel. Allied intelligence assessed that the coastline was held by a single regiment from the 718th Coastal Defense Division, a static unit composed largely of older soldiers and foreign conscripts, men considered unsuitable for frontline service elsewhere. Resistance, planners believed, would be minimal. What they did not realize was that in March, the 341st Infantry Division had quietly moved into the sector. This was an entirely different force. Younger troops. Officers and non-commissioned leaders hardened by years of fighting in the East. Better weapons. Stronger discipline. A unit prepared not merely to hold ground, but to kill anyone who tried to take it. The invasion blueprint also rested on another critical assumption, that air and naval fire would annihilate the defenses before the first assault wave arrived. Strategic bombers were supposed to shatter the beach, carving craters that advancing troops could use as cover. Naval guns would smash the concrete emplacements that commanded the shoreline. Neither expectation held. Low cloud on the morning of June 6 forced bomber crews to delay release, desperate to avoid striking friendly ships below. In those few lost seconds, the aircraft passed their targets. The bombs fell inland, exploding harmlessly in empty fields. The bunkers remained intact. And when the first landing ramps dropped, the men stepping into the surf would face a defense that was not broken, but fully awake. The enemy defenses were still fully intact. The naval bombardment had lasted less than an hour. Rear Admiral Charles Winford had demanded far more, hours of continuous fire to pulverize the cliffs and silence every gun overlooking the beach. He warned repeatedly that anything less would be disastrous. His warnings were ignored. To launch the largest amphibious assault ever attempted with this level of naval gunfire is criminal, Winford reportedly said. History would prove him correct. Then there were the tanks. The assault plan called for 30 amphibious medium tanks to land with the 1st Infantry Wave at Redcliffe Shore, providing moving firepower to suppress enemy positions. These were modified vehicles fitted with flotation skirts, designed to swim ashore from offshore release points. But the channel that morning was unforgiving. Heavy swells and crosscurrents tore at the canvas screens. In the eastern sector, 28 tanks were launched. 26 never reached land. They sank in full view of the beach. Crews were trapped inside, dragged down by the weight of steel and ammunition. In the western sector, one tank commander refused to risk it, ordering his vehicles brought in directly on landing craft. His decision saved every crew under his command. The infantry was not so fortunate. The soldiers of the 2nd and 31st Infantry Divisions came ashore without armored support, without effective air cover, and facing defenses far stronger than intelligence had predicted. The killing began at once. Many men died before leaving their landing craft. German gunners had pre-measured the shoreline. They knew exactly where the ramps would drop. When the steel doors slammed down, Streams of fire ripped through the opening. Those who survived the first seconds leapt into deep water, burdened with heavy packs and weapons. Some drowned within yards of the sand. Others staggered ashore only to find nothing resembling cover. The craters that were supposed to shield them were nowhere to be found. Able Company of the 141st Infantry Regiment, part of the 31st Division, landed directly in front of a fortified enemy position. Within 10 minutes, the unit was effectively destroyed. His warnings were ignored. To launch the largest amphibious assault ever attempted with this level of naval gunfire is criminal, Winford reportedly said. History would prove him correct. Then there were the tanks. The assault plan called for 30 amphibious medium tanks to land with the 1st Infantry Wave at Redcliffe Shore, providing moving firepower to suppress enemy positions. These were modified vehicles fitted with flotation skirts, designed to swim ashore from offshore release points. But the channel that morning was unforgiving. Heavy swells and crosscurrents tore at the canvas screens. In the eastern sector, 28 tanks were launched. 26 never reached land. They sank in full view of the beach. Crews were trapped inside, dragged down by the weight of steel and ammunition. In the western sector, one tank commander refused to risk it, ordering his vehicles brought in directly on landing craft. His decision saved every crew under his command. The infantry was not so fortunate. The soldiers of the 2nd and 31st Infantry Divisions came ashore without armored support, without effective air cover, and facing defenses far stronger than intelligence had predicted. The killing began at once. Many men died before leaving their landing craft. German gunners had pre-measured the shoreline. They knew exactly where the ramps would drop. When the steel doors slammed down, streams of fire ripped through the opening. Those who survived the first seconds leapt into deep water, burdened with heavy packs and weapons. Some drowned within yards of the sand. Others staggered ashore only to find nothing resembling cover. The craters that were supposed to shield them were nowhere to be found. Able Company of the 141st Infantry Regiment, part of the 31st Division, landed directly in front of a fortified enemy position. Within 10 minutes, the unit was effectively destroyed. Out of more than 200 men, fewer than 20 reached the seawall alive. Those who made it found themselves pinned in a nightmare of geometry. Behind them, the tide crept upward. Ahead, a gradual incline of open sand leading to a concrete barrier, then marsh grass, then steep bluffs crowned with enemy emplacements. Every approach was locked under overlapping fire. Men pressed themselves against steel obstacles designed to tear open landing craft hulls. They flattened into the sand, praying the bullets would pass inches above them. Some were paralyzed by shock, incapable of responding to shouted orders. Others lay wounded, calling for medics who could not reach them. According to the operational schedule, American forces were supposed to be a mile inland by mid-morning. 6 hours after the first landings, they controlled barely 10 yards of beach. Brigadier General Samuel Kerr came ashore at Redcliffe at 7:40 a.m., nearly an hour after the opening wave. At 52, he was the assistant division commander and one of the highest-ranking officers to land that day. His craft was raked by machine gun fire during the approach. 3 men were killed stepping off the ramp. Kerr had opposed a daylight assault from the beginning. During planning conferences, he had argued forcefully for a pre-dawn landing, convinced that surprise offered the only real chance of survival. His superiors dismissed the idea. Air and naval fire would neutralize the defenses, they insisted. The enemy would be overwhelmed, undertrained, and shaken. Kerr's objections were not pessimism, they were experience. Before the invasion, he had served as an advisor to Allied landing forces across multiple theaters. He had studied amphibious warfare in detail. He had helped train units for assaults exactly like this one. He knew how easily plans collapsed once the shooting started. At a high-level landing conference the year before, Kerr had laid out his warnings plainly. What he was seeing now, pinned beneath the cliffs of Redcliffe Shore, was exactly what he had feared. Surprise is one of the decisive elements of any assault, he had told the assembled commanders months earlier. I strongly favor a night landing. I do not believe a daylight attack can succeed. He was not alone. Major General Victor Hale, commander of Coastal Corps, had argued the same point. So had Rear Admiral Charles Winford, responsible for delivering the assault forces to Redcliffe Shore. All three warned that without darkness, the landing force would be exposed at its most vulnerable moment. All three were overruled. Senior planners believed that overwhelming firepower would compensate for the loss of surprise. Airstrikes and naval guns, they insisted, would shatter the defenses and leave the enemy disoriented. They were wrong, and Brigadier General Samuel Kerr knew it. Still, once the decision was final, Kerr turned his attention to preparation. On the afternoon before the invasion, he gathered his staff and delivered a briefing unlike any rehearsal they had experienced. "This will not go according to plan," he told them. "Boats will arrive late. Units will land in the wrong sectors. Some men will not land at all. If you wait for orders, you will die. You must adapt, keep moving, and think for yourselves." Now, on a beach strewn with bodies and shattered equipment, Kerr did exactly that. He stood up. While other men crawled, hugged the sand, or lay motionless, Kerr walked upright across the open beach. Bullets snapped overhead, kicking sand into his boots, but he moved as if the fire did not exist. He went from group to group, shaking men out of shock, cursing, pointing, ordering them forward. He directed them toward the bluffs, toward the only ground that offered a chance to break the trap. Near the seawall, he encountered a cluster of soldiers pinned down under relentless fire. He demanded to know who they were. "Rangers," someone shouted. Kerr's reply was immediate. "Then get up and show them how it's done." The words were not intended for history. They were a demand: stop waiting to be killed. The Rangers on Redcliffe Shore that morning were elite volunteers, men who had survived punishing training designed for special assaults. Many had originally been assigned to a nearby cliff objective believed to house enemy artillery threatening the landings. Some had scaled those cliffs in one of the most daring actions of the day. Others, elements of the 4th and 6th Ranger battalions, had been diverted when communications collapsed and orders never arrived. They landed instead into the same inferno as the regular infantry. They were fitter, better trained, more experienced. None of that mattered while trapped behind a seawall with machine gun fire slicing inches overhead. What Kerr provided was something no training exercise could. Example: a commander who walked where others crawled, who accepted the same risk, or more, than the men around him. Nearby, a soldier carried a Bangalore charge, a long steel tube packed with explosives meant to clear wire obstacles. Kerr ordered him forward, directing the charge into the tangle blocking the narrow path up the bluff. The blast tore a gap in the wire. The first man through was cut down instantly by sniper fire. The men behind him hesitated, frozen by the sudden loss. Kerr did not hesitate. He stepped through the opening himself and began climbing the slope beyond. When he looked back, men were following. At first, only a handful. But it was enough, then a few more followed. And then more still. Within hours, scattered groups of soldiers were moving inland at several points along Redcliffe Shore. They were no longer following the invasion plan, because the invasion plan no longer existed. They followed corporals, sergeants, junior officers, and sometimes simply the man beside them who decided that moving forward was better than waiting to die. Colonel Andrew Whitman, commander of the 18th Infantry Regiment, captured the moment with merciless honesty. "There are only two kinds of men left on this beach," he told those around him. "The ones who are dead, and the ones who will be if they stay here. Now move." By late afternoon, Redcliffe Shore was no longer a slaughter ground. It had become a foothold, narrow, unstable, bought with blood, but real. And at a critical moment, the Navy intervened. While offshore commanders debated withdrawal, Rear Admiral Lewis Harrow asked a simple question: could naval fire still influence the battle? The answer came quickly. Destroyers that had pulled back after the initial bombardment turned around and drove straight toward the shoreline. Some closed to within 700 yards of the beach, far closer than doctrine allowed. The water was shallow. Charts were unreliable. One mistake could strand a ship under enemy guns. The captains did not hesitate. From the battleship USS Granite, Rear Admiral Marcus Bell transmitted a blunt message across the fleet. "Get in close. They're tearing our men apart up there. End it." The destroyers responded with everything they had. They fired directly at the bluffs, targeting bunkers and machine gun nests the bombers had missed. Guns overheated. Ammunition ran low. Some ships fired until nothing remained to fire. Later, Colonel Henry Wallace, Chief of Staff of the 2nd Infantry Division, would state plainly, "I am convinced naval gunfire made survival possible. Without it, we would never have crossed the beach." But shells alone did not take Redcliffe shore. Men did. Men like Kerr. Like Whitman. And hundreds of unnamed soldiers who stood up, moved forward, and refused to remain targets. 15 miles to the west, on Blue Water Beach, a different kind of leadership unfolded. Brigadier General Arthur Reynolds was 57 years old, the oldest officer to land with the assault waves and the only general to step ashore in the first landing. He walked with a cane, the result of wounds suffered decades earlier. He carried a concealed heart condition that would have barred him from combat had doctors known. Reynolds had requested permission to land with the first wave 3 times. Twice he was refused. The third request, submitted formally and in writing, was approved, likely because his superiors assumed he would not survive. Major General Stephen Caldwell, commanding the 5th Infantry Division, signed the authorization fully aware of the risk. Reynolds' written justification was simple. The momentum and confidence of the first elements ashore may determine the outcome of the operation. I believe my presence can materially affect that moment. This was not bravado. Reynolds understood that soldiers fought differently when their commanders shared their danger. He had learned that lesson in an earlier war, leading troops through gas, fire, and chaos. Between wars, he had pursued public service, holding senior administrative posts, governing distant territories, losing elections, enduring failure. When the Second War came, age and illness gave him every excuse to stay behind. He refused. He returned to uniform, fought in earlier campaigns, and insisted on joining the invasion force. At Blue Water Beach, currents pushed the first wave nearly half a mile from its intended landing zone. Reynolds stepped ashore, surveyed the terrain under fire, and made a decision that saved lives. "We'll begin from here," he said calmly. Rather than force his men to relocate under fire, he redirected the assault inland from their actual position. He personally scouted exits off the beach, walking openly as bullets cracked nearby. He stood at the water's edge as later waves arrived, redirecting units one by one. His son, Captain Daniel Reynolds, landed that same morning, at Redcliffe Shore. They were the only father and son to land on enemy beaches that day. Years later, when asked to name the bravest act he had ever witnessed, General Richard Harlan answered without pause. Arthur Reynolds on Blue Water Beach. Reynolds was awarded the nation's highest decoration for his actions. He died of a heart attack weeks later, still at the front, still with his men. He never learned of the honor. Field Marshal Arthur Hawthorne commanded all Allied ground forces on the day of the landings. He was Britain's most recognizable general, the victor of Desert Ridge, the man credited with breaking the enemy's momentum in North Africa. Hawthorne had personally overseen the final version of the invasion plan. He had widened the assault from 3 divisions to 5, arguing that the original design was dangerously narrow. In the months before the invasion, he toured American camps across England, speaking directly to troops, building confidence. His popularity among American soldiers was real, even if his opinions of their senior officers were less generous. On June 6, Hawthorne watched events with particular intensity. His immediate concern lay with the British sectors, Amber Beach and Steel Beach, as well as the Canadian landing at Maple Shore, all under his authority. But American performance on Red Cliff and Blue Water mattered deeply. Failure there would expose his entire flank. Reports from Red Cliff during the morning were grim. Hawthorne knew that General Harlan was weighing evacuation. He also understood what that would mean. Pulling troops off one beach and funneling them through another would create a logistical nightmare that could unravel the invasion itself. Hawthorne considered alternatives. If Red Cliff collapsed entirely, he contemplated diverting American coastal corps through Amber Beach, threading them through the British sector to preserve momentum. But that plan depended on British success. And British success was not assured. Amber Beach was assigned to the veteran 52nd Division, soldiers hardened in earlier campaigns. Their landing went better than the American assault, but it was far from easy. Artillery and mortar fire struck the waves heavily. Villages had to be cleared room by room, often under direct fire. At Steel Beach, the 3rd Infantry Division came ashore with orders to seize Greyhaven, the largest city in the invasion zone. Greyhaven was meant to fall on the first day. It would take more than a month. In the afternoon, enemy armor, elements of the 23rd Panzer Division, counterattacked, threatening to split the British beachhead in two. Only the timely arrival of airborne reinforcements stabilized the situation. Hawthorne's timeline was already in tatters by nightfall. But the beaches held. And at Red Cliff Shore, against nearly every expectation, the Americans held as well. The contrast between British and American performance was not a simple tale of one force succeeding while the other faltered. Both armies faced disciplined, determined opposition. Both suffered severe losses. Both achieved minimum objectives while missing their optimistic goals. The difference lay in how they fought. British operations were deliberate. At Amber Beach, infantry advanced alongside armor in carefully coordinated steps, supported by artillery and airstrikes. It was methodical, controlled, and rooted in years of experience. American operations were disorderly. At Red Cliff, doctrine collapsed within minutes. Units landed in the wrong sectors. Officers assigned to lead companies died before reaching shore. Radios failed. Chains of command shattered. What replaced doctrine was initiative. Small groups formed spontaneously. Sergeants led when lieutenants fell. Privates took charge when no one else remained. The fighting became personal, improvised, and relentless. British training emphasized obedience to plan. The plan was the plan. American training, particularly among citizen soldiers drawn from reserve formations, was looser. When the plan failed, Americans were more likely to invent a new one on the spot. This trait could be dangerous. It sometimes produced confusion, wasted effort, and unnecessary risk. But on Red Cliff Shore, where the original plan was dead before it touched land, that flexibility proved decisive. British observers watched the battle with a mix of disbelief and growing respect. The 31st Infantry Division that landed at Red Cliff was a reserve formation, built from regional militias across the American interior. Many of its men had never been under fire. By British standards, they were inexperienced, precisely the kind of troops senior British officers had feared would break. They carried history with them. The division drew recruits from regions once divided by civil conflict. Its insignia reflected that past, two colors interlocked, symbolizing reconciliation. These were not professional soldiers in the European mold. They were shopkeepers, farmhands, factory workers, men who had joined for modest pay, family tradition, or simple loyalty to country. They had trained together for years, first part-time, then full-time, preparing for a war they knew was inevitable. They had practiced landings on a remote English beach chosen because it mirrored Red Cliff Shore. What no exercise could teach them was how they would respond when everything went wrong. On June 6th, they found out, they had rehearsed the landing again and again. Timetables memorized. Routes traced on maps until they could be drawn from memory. Nothing in those rehearsals resembled what awaited them on June 6th. The 2nd Infantry Division, known by its Crimson Shield, was supposed to be the stabilizing force. These were veterans. Men who had fought through earlier campaigns, who recognized the sound of incoming fire and understood what it meant when the air suddenly went quiet. They had buried friends before. They had survived German weapons before. They landed alongside the reserve formations at Redcliffe Shore. The theory was simple: experience would steady inexperience. Veteran leadership would carry the untested through their first fight. Reality was merciless. Veterans died as quickly as newcomers. Enemy gunners did not distinguish between campaign ribbons and clean uniforms. Machine gun fire erased rank, history, and reputation in seconds. And yet, something extraordinary happened. Under conditions that should have shattered any unit, with their tanks sunk offshore, with senior officers dead or missing, with radios destroyed and plans meaningless, these soldiers attacked. Not as a single force executing a refined doctrine, but as clusters of men who refused to accept the beach as their grave. What unsettled British observers most was not American efficiency. It was American refusal. A stubbornness that bordered on irrationality. A determination to continue forward when withdrawal would have been the logical, professional decision. It was not graceful. It ignored the manuals. But it worked. In the days following the invasion, Field Marshal Arthur Hawthorne personally awarded the Imperial Order of Valor to Brigadier General Samuel Kerr. The decoration was among Britain's most prestigious honors for battlefield leadership and was rarely bestowed upon foreign officers. The citation praised Kerr's conduct under intense fire, his ability to rally shattered units, and his willingness to expose himself repeatedly to danger to restore momentum. This was no ceremonial gesture. It was an institutional acknowledgement that, at a critical moment, an American commander had saved the assault through personal courage and relentless will. Other honors followed. British decorations were awarded to American officers and enlisted men for actions taken on the beaches. These were not diplomatic tokens. They reflected a genuine shift in perception, from doubt to respect. German accounts echoed the same conclusion. Defenders later reported disbelief at what they witnessed. From their bunkers, they watched landing craft arrive again and again. They saw men cut down in the surf, and then saw more replace them. The assault made no sense from a tactical perspective. Yet it did not stop. The German defenses had been meticulously prepared. Engineers had transformed the tidal zone into a killing field: steel obstacles, mine stakes, reinforced barriers, interlocking lanes of fire. Above the shoreline, concrete emplacements commanded every approach. Machine guns overlapped. Mortars were pre-registered. Every meter was covered. By all conventional measures, the position was impregnable. And yet it fell. Not because of perfect planning. Not because of flawless execution. But because ordinary men refused to concede defeat. Omaha, Redcliffe Shore, was not a victory won by doctrine. It was a victory wrested from chaos by stubborn initiative, by small groups acting without orders, by leaders who stood up when instinct said to stay down. That day changed how Britain viewed its ally. The Americans were no longer untested partners with impressive factories and uncertain soldiers. They were proven. And the beach that nearly broke the invasion became the place where that truth was paid for, and learned, in blood.